Most of you probably have not lived on a desert planet like Tatooine, Jakku, Vulcan, or Arrakis, and that's okay, because I haven't either. One of you asked me if I could make Mos Espa from the Book of Boba Fett in Blender, and like after I spit out my coffee all over my cat, I said, yeah, sure, I'll give it a shot. So this is what I did. Feel free to come along and see if I can pull it off. I opened Blender and was like, how would I do this? Being that I'm a generalist and not an environment artist like Adrian Lambert, he's really good. I'm not much of a painter, and so I did what I do best. I made a gigantic plane. I figured that land is big, so I made it like 25 square kilometers. I have no idea how big Mos Espa is. I mean, I could probably figure it out, but no, I wasn't doing that for this. So I needed a pit that the city sits in, because it sits in a hole. See, look, city in a hole. So I made a circle and then shaped it into something that looked like a canyon hole, and then I converted it to polygons because it wouldn't just let me extrude it, because that would be too easy for me to screw everything up faster. So I extruded it, and there I had canyon walls. Now I figured that the walls are about 100 or so feet tall, so that's like 30 meters, and it's true because the internet told me so. I thought maybe I could thicken the walls and extrude, but nope, it wasn't having it. Okay, maybe I could cut it out of the floor. I made it into a solid shape by selecting the edges on the top and the bottom and right-clicking, then choosing Fill. There, I had a block. Now, using a Boolean modifier on the plane, I could choose the block and cut it out. Then I extruded the whole plane, moved the block around a bit, and got a cutout. I positioned the camera, ignoring the fact that the normals were totally screwed up after I smooth shaded the object, and I tried to sculpt. Nope, this was going down faster than the ratings on this video. I needed a new strategy here because Blender is great, but the geometry was going to get really huge really quickly on this approach, even instanced. So I switched it up. I made a new scene, positioned the camera at like 300 feet off the ground, and added a 25 square mile grid again and placed it at 0 on the y-axis. Because this time's gonna be different. Oh yes, this time will be. So I had to adjust the clipping planes because Blender sets it at 100. Seriously, 100. I can't do anything with that, so I bumped it up. While I was there, I did it for the camera too, because the camera was at 100 too. Oh, come on! I also changed the renderer to cycles. Okay, whatever, you're bored now, let's move on. I added a ground type texture to the grid, just a random rock PBR texture. The actual link will be in the file on Patreon if anybody wants it, along with this whole file. Link is in the description. I digress, we move on. I pushed the bump to some ungodly number like 300 so that I could see it at this scale and not have to use displacement. Then, I adjusted the color with a ramp. I needed to see what it would look like with sunlight, so I added a sun to the world shader. Blender has a really decent sun shader thingy. It's really nice. If you haven't tried it, you definitely should check it out. Here's where I broke from my last attempt. I cheated and I used Ant Landscape. If you'd seen my ice video, I used it there too. I'd prefer to use Houdini or satellite data for this, but I'm keeping this one in Blender for now. Subscribe and help me get to 100,000 followers, and I'll do like all these other programs too on this channel. Deal? Maybe I'll make a new channel. Good, let's continue. So I added in a mesa from the Ant Landscape, and I scaled it up. I also dropped the ground shader on it, made a duplicate and called it Cliffs. I changed the type to Object, and made sure that the scale was right by creating a cube that's 100 feet high, and then adjusting the mesa size to match. Then I scattered a bunch around and assigned the ground shader to all of them. After that, I duplicated the ground, moved it up, cut out the parts that covered the city hole area, and cut and moved the geometry to shape it around the hole so I had more of a flat ground and not a Monument Valley feel. Then I made another duplicate of the grid, named it Bottom Ground, and cut away everything I didn't need. This will be the city floor. Then I did the same thing for the top areas where I'd want the buildings later. Yay, I had a landscape, and the scale might work. Time for buildings, because no city in a hole is an actual city in a hole without buildings in a hole. I'll go fast here because all I did was like extrude, loop cut, extrude, bevel, loop cut, scale, loop cut, extrude, inset, over and over again until I had lots of shapes and lots of buildings and my eyes were totally bleeding. This was probably the most fun part, not because of the eye thing, but because these buildings are pretty simple, and I kept them as simple as possible so as not to kill the Blender. In reality, these would probably have much more detail to them. Then I gave them a simple procedural shader that looked dirty because sand, it gets everywhere. Once I had all the buildings I wanted, I put them in one collection to start with. Time to make the city. Hair systems are great for this, but I didn't use that because I made a single vertex and named it GeoNodes. Now I was locked in, no escape, no garbage chute, no soup for you. I went into the geometry workspace. Here I dragged in the collection of buildings. This is really cool as we can scatter collections, but I needed something to scatter them on. So this is where the ground came in. I dragged that in and hooked it up to the group output. Then I distributed points on faces and turned the density way down. That gave me points that I could use to instance the collection onto without killing the blender. Leave that number high and see what happens in the next step. I triple dog dare you. Do it. I dropped in an instance on points node, checked pick instance, and got a city of dill pickles. After playing around with the settings, checking separate children to get access to the whole collection, I added in a scale instance with a random value hooked up to the scale, and a rotate instances node with a random value hooked up to the Z rotation by way of a combined XYZ node, like I explained in this video above in way more depth. So now I had to start. Now I threw in a tower building that I'd modeled before and had something to start with. I played around with the lighting a bit, tried HDRI images, and arrived at something I liked. Next, I needed to populate the city around the giant hull because sprawl. For this, I duplicated the GeoNodes single vert and assigned the geometry nodes setup to it. Then I'd added in some geometry to scatter the top buildings on. I decided to create a new GeoNodes duplicate, make sure that it was set to the correct GeoNodes modifier, and renamed it Valley. And then made a duplicate of that modifier, which makes a new copy of the whole setup similar to what we do with shaders, then named the new one Top. Once I had that, I could change the input geometry to the new top buildings geometry we just made, and there, scattered urban sprawl. Now I just played with the scale some and made it better. After tweaking the setup for a little while, I had a base city. The rest was duplicating the setup for foreground buildings, tweaking the lighting more, tweaking the placements of the cliffs, realizing I wasn't completely satisfied after a couple of hours total, realized that for the real shots it would take quite a bit more time, and realizing that I had to wake up for work in the morning, yeah. I added some fog like I did in my Ready Player One inspired video by adding a cube with a volume shader, threw in some cheap ant landscape mountains in the background, and realized it needed ships. So I went back and modeled ships. I animated it, rendered it, ran it through Resolve for some color tweaks, and there. Not too bad for a few hours work. I need to do this for real at some point, but the whole file is up on Patreon if you want. If you're still here, subscribe before the video ends. We're running out of time. Thanks, and see ya.